Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of First Amendment Museum Unscripted. I'm Max Nospish, the Manager of Visitor Experiences and Education here at the First Amendment Museum, located in Augusta, Maine. The First Amendment Museum is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to promoting the understanding and use of the 5 freedoms found in the First Amendment. Today, in our Unscripted episode, we are talking about First Amendment audits. I want to thank so much all of our panelists that came out today, or joined me on Zoom, I guess I should say, to talk about this issue. This is, when I put these together, I often find I have topics where, yeah, I'm sure everybody's willing to speak on that. No problem. I'll find a couple speakers in a couple days or so. But this is a topic that it's actually very hard to find people willing to speak publicly on. So all 3 of our panelists are doing wonderful work helping us out today and taking the time out of their days to talk about this issue. So if anybody's watching this, because I know this is the topic that will definitely get some comments and definitely get some shares. If you guys feel like there was no viewpoint represented, or you missed, or none of our panelists spoke to a certain issue, you can always email me at mnospish, Nosbisch, at firstamendmentmuseum.org, all lowercase, all one word, and we can talk about anything you want to talk about. So that's who I am, and that's what we're talking about today. We want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Scott, if you want to take it from here.
Sure, Max. Thank you. My name is Scott McClatchy. I am coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a partner in a Georgia-based law firm of several hundred lawyers in multiple states, and my specialty of practice is representing law enforcement agencies. I've represented law enforcement agencies for several decades, both coasts, primarily California and North Carolina. And I developed a keen interest in First Amendment audits at the onset, what I perceive of the movement, where it really began picking up steam, 2014, 2015. I developed a training course that I still use to try and educate law enforcement. And as I was telling Max before the program, I think a lot of our officers understand a lot of the principles that the auditors are trying to make, but there's still room for education, I think, on both sides. So I'm happy to be here.
My name is Evan Archambault. Thanks for having me, Max. I'm currently out in the central coast of California. I currently work at a university in the area. I actually work also at a law enforcement agency, non-sworn, so I work on the non-sworn side. And I've been participating in some First Amendment activities and First Amendment audits probably about a year now, in actively editing, posting, and creating some of my own content. So kind of an interesting perspective of not being a legal scholar or anything, but just kind of being in, starting the beginnings of my own work. And, I was telling the panelists earlier before we started, I kind of got snubbed by my employer a long time ago, about 5 years ago, and really just kind of brought my awareness into the First Amendment rights community. I never really thought much of it. I mean, I knew of it, but I didn't really thought I'd be part of it. And then that kind of just brought my attention to it and really enlightened my wanting to be part of the cause and be part of the solution and educate as many people as I could, as far as, not only our First Amendment rights, but all of our constitutional rights for that sake. So thanks for having me.
And thank you for having me. I'm Dave Dewberry. I am a college professor at Rider University in the beautiful heart of central New Jersey. I'm a professor of communication, so I study free speech and as well as many of other things. And so my research has led me to look at First Amendment audits, and I've published a few articles and chapters on that. And so I'm happy to speak with everybody here today.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. So I want to start off with a very just basic question for those who may be watching and not know what a First Amendment audit is. What is a First Amendment audit, and how do they work? What is that? So if anybody wants to dive in and take it over, and then pile on.
I don't mind starting if it makes it easy. So basically, from my perspective as a viewer of these videos, usually there's somebody, usually a male, who goes to a public place. It could be outside, could be inside, with cameras, multiple cameras, live streaming, recording to hard disk or something to that extent. And they go to a public place and just engage in recording in public to exercise the right to record. And usually this behavior creates some sort of, arouses the suspicion or attention, I should say, of other people. Could be a member of the law enforcement community, could be a citizen, could be a civilian, could be a public employee. Usually there's an encounter. The encounter is, I don't want to say hostile, but usually not friendly. Sometimes it's friendly. And, if the law enforcement's not part of that initial encounter, they quickly show up. There's usually an encounter with discussion of some sort. Sometimes it's productive, sometimes it's not, at getting a resolution. And the ultimate goal is to arouse awareness of the right to record. And so that's basically the basic idea, I think, of First Amendment audit.
Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I hopefully I left a lot of room for adding
of
details and things. That's why I took the first position, so I wouldn't have to fill in the details.
Yeah, anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't mind going next. Being someone who I would also say took a lot of time watching First Amendment audits on YouTube. Realistically, that's really the only platform that I've seen that's taken off on it. A good 5 or 6 years watching it. Never thought I would go out there and do it myself. And then, interestingly enough, my daughter asked me to go to VidCon with her last June. For those of you who don't know, it's a basically used to be called YouTube or Playlist Live, and so all the YouTubers and everything get together. I knew nothing about it, and I went there and kind of got excited about actually being behind the camera. I honestly never thought I would. Got my won a GoPro there. And then slowly just kind of started going out and taking video, and I was like, well, this is kind of fun. And then I was like, you know what, I think I could probably go out and do this. And I would say the first time I went out and tried my first audit, it was scary. It was super scary trying to people being behind the camera and people reacting to you. You don't come across as genuine and normal. You kind of come across as crazy, which some of these videos show people as, and it's hard. It's hard engaging people and then not also getting frustrated at somebody, or in my first encounter with law enforcement, I was like, I didn't know how to react, and I didn't know how to say things properly. And I work for a law enforcement agency, and I deal with the public all the time, and I deal with people in stressful situations. But then being behind the camera and being approached in a different way that I was not used to was hard, and it was very interesting. The perspective that other people have when they come up to you, it's a craft. I think with anything else, the people that are good at it are good at it for a reason, and the people who are bad at it, I can understand why it's not an easy thing, but it's very interesting. I've also done a lot of audits where I don't actually go out I do go out myself, but I've just done the filming. I haven't done the actual participating in it. And I've gotten a lot of really good perspective just being behind the lens and just doing the editing portion of it. I feel like I've also learned a lot just listening to how other people act. And as I go forward, I'm definitely going to be one of those auditors that is definitely more calm and trying to deal with people and not trying to arouse this negative attention towards it, because I think you can get a lot more done having a conversation with people and trying to educate as to what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish, instead of just instigating a negative situation or a negative connotation. So it's an interesting process, and I do recommend everyone to go out there and at least go observe it, if not want to do it themselves, just to see kind of how it works. It's different.
I will just add an historical perspective, because I followed the movement from what I believe were some of its earliest roots, and got to know, not personally, but recognize on site from their postings on YouTube and elsewhere, a lot of the auditors around the country, the more popular ones with the most views. And initially, not exclusively, but for the most part, initially, the auditors were bringing their smartphones out into locations in public where there was police activity, and they would film the police officer on the traffic stop. They might have a scanner so they know where to show up and film the officer walking up to a call or standing around outside. And in the early days, before the police generally began to understand that people are recognized by courts to have a right to record, we would see a lot of the hand over the face, like, are you filming me? Why are you doing that? I haven't given you permission. And of course, the Supreme Court has never actually addressed the issue, But if they ever did, I don't think the Supreme Court of the United States would say that a person who is merely filming out in public what they can see with their own eye needs permission from what is in their lens finder in order to take a photo or record it. But we moved from a lot of the auditors focusing on police work out in public to, in more recent years, well, as they could get fewer and fewer officers willing to maybe engage with them, as the police got more educated on this, they started bringing their cameras inside police buildings, inside police lobbies, which, as you can imagine, can cause a lot of conflict. People visiting the police department, civilian employees, officers, what are you doing? Why are you in here? No, you can't point your camera in that direction. And of course, for the auditors who are trying to make a point, that was very great content for them. And of course, a lot of the auditors are funded by ads and their viewers. So some of them you will hear them repeatedly say, hey, if you like that, hit that like button, ring that bell, because they are monetizing their efforts. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but that's how a lot of these auditors do make their money. My concern of late, and really in the last couple of years, has been the effort by some of, I would say, the more aggressive auditors taking their cameras outside of where maybe they're in a public forum or a public place, but they're going into areas where they know they're going to disrupt people in terms of just their sense of security and situational settings, such as in residential neighborhoods, such as standing in front of a home as a family's unloading their groceries and focusing in on the husband and the wife and the kids, and coming outside. Why are you filming my family? Don't touch me, man. Don't touch me. You touch me and I'll sue you. Well, what are you doing out here? And to me, that's not so much the First Amendment, because the First Amendment only serves as a prohibition on what the government can do to stop or prevent your speech or your news gathering. And so I hate to see sometimes these situations with some of the auditors being, I'm actively trying to push the buttons on some civilian who's not associated with the government. But then again, who does the civilian go inside and call? The police. So ultimately, we do get that response that Evan and David have referred to. So I have that overall historical perspective on this, and I understand the movement, and I also understand the law enforcement side. I've been in law enforcement myself, and there is a tension there very often. It doesn't have to be, but very often there can be a real tension.
So thank you guys. And I want to think about what are some of the positives and negatives of the First Amendment audit movement. And maybe that's not the best way of framing it, but what are some arguments for First Amendment audits as being a positive thing? And what are some arguments against First Amendments as being a negative thing? Because this is something that people have reached out to the First Amendment Museum about. And it seems the impression I've gotten is it's a kind of controversial phenomenon. So what are some of the pros and the cons, arguments for and against?
Good.
Really like Scott's point of view as far as, people taking it to the extreme, because you get, especially when you go out there, you get a lot of people saying, hey, you don't have the right to film me. You need to have some sort of disclosure act, or you need my permission and everything. So I guess if you're looking in terms of, traditional time, place, and forum, as far as exercising your rights, I think that's really where it should be. And like Scott was saying, when people used to just go out and film, interactions with law enforcement or whatever. But yeah, I do think once you take your right to your First Amendment and take it to somebody's house or take it to a private residence, I think at that point you've taken that right too far, or your perception of that right too far. So I guess if you're trying to say there's a pro, I think you definitely want to hold government accountable. That's what it's for. But on your negative shed of that, are you trying to just arouse somebody's suspicion or whatever just to get a negative connotation so that law enforcement will come to you instead of creating a situation where you can have dialogue with somebody?
Yeah, and just to that point, there was some conflict within the auditor community several years back. Actually, it was a popular California auditor that some of his colleagues in California and elsewhere were calling out basically saying, hey, he's getting these responses because he or people associated with him are stiffing in the calls to the police to get them to come out. And the other auditors were saying it should happen naturally. It either happens or it doesn't. You should not be going out, stiffing in a call, and then engaging in something perhaps confrontational with a civilian just so you can capture the law enforcement response. So there's been that concern within the auditor community itself.
Yeah,
David, did you have something?
Yeah, I would just echo, not only this discussion, but the previous one. If we're looking at this situation in terms of, what's good or bad, Scott, you've mentioned, familiar with the movement and stuff and things like that. I'm just kind of curious in one part, but the first video I ever saw was in 2013, which makes it about a decade ago, and I think it was Jeff Davis. But some of the legal scholarship that I've read kind of contextualized this First Amendment auditing in the background of, starting in the 1960s with the Black Panthers who would follow the police with cameras, traditional cameras, point and click kind of things back then, notepads, but also weapons. And so Ronald Reagan put a quick stop to that because of the weapons following the police when he was governor. And then you have the 1990s with the Berkeley Cop Watch movement being created, and not too long after that, the Rodney King. So, in terms of good, this First Amendment audit, it's been around for a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's a type of First Amendment advocacy that's been around for quite some time. And I've really tried to push, and I don't think it's a good argument, but I try to push it nonetheless, that the Boston Massacre, right? Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, of watching the abuse of the King's troops who were acting as the police force in Boston, as one of the first, kind of instances of that. But the history of that kind of situation and scenario is a little complex to pull that argument off successfully. So in terms of good, I think it's a long-standing practice of observing this. In terms of negative, right, we've talked about the group here, we've talked about, interfering in personal situations, at home and things like that. And I'd defer to Scott on this. But my understanding is, neighborhoods are open to free speech activities just as long as you not stay stationary in front of a house. And I guess that's what these auditors are doing. I haven't seen these particular examples. But when we start to say, the auditors are calling in the police to kind of create that situation, right, a contrived situation, I also think back to criticisms of the TV show Cops and Live PD, who were basically doing the same thing. And, they've recently been canceled, I guess relatively recently in the past few years. For those kind of situations. So, when I think of bad, what's going on here, right? Evan, you mentioned that, sometimes you feel, I think you said, it comes across as a little crazy for somebody to be walking around with a camera or something like that. And I do agree with you. It is a craft. It's an art. It's a skill that people need to learn, because it's a very intimidating process to even go through it. But I also remember, when we think about how these people come across, that the people who fight for the First Amendment freedoms are not necessarily nice people or friendly people, right? People with popular ideas and popular speech aren't the ones who need their ideas protected. It's the people that challenge things, right? And so, based on my research, the people who, communists, have done more for free speech than any other group in the United States. In terms of freedom of religion, Jehovah's Witnesses have done that. And so a lot of people complain about those kinds of people. So when we say, they might be intrusive, invasive, and contrived and those kind of things, those are the people that help define what we know as free speech today.
So what do citizen journalists, citizen activists, First Amendment auditors, what are some things they need to know, either from the legal side, the cultural side, tips on how to do it successfully, tips on how to do it safely? What do First Amendment auditors need to know in your perspective?
One thing I found in my research on this, and Scott's right, there's never been a Supreme Court case on this, but there have been Supreme Court cases on, the right to record news, right to what's in public. There's no expectation of privacy in public, and all these kind of other things that go on that help auditors. And so what I found looking at the arguments of First Amendment auditors, most of them know the case law pretty well. The circuit court case law, some of them know that a little bit, but the circuit court cases are a bit off compared to true First Amendment auditing. But they seem to know the law very, very well. And it's those people that I've seen do well in this kind of activity But I think it's when I see people who just seem to be copying or mirroring others tend to not do so well. So I think it's a little bit more than just watching and doing, but actually having that kind of legal background and knowledge is key. Also, good camera work. I mean, that's when it comes down to it.
Yeah, and let me just echo what Dave referred to is there are some auditors who know and can recite case law better than the law enforcement officers they're dealing with. I mean, most cops are not constitutional scholars. That's not part of the job. In your law enforcement academy training, you get a lot of training in the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, very little when it comes to First Amendments, absent maybe discussion about parades, disturbances, things like that. So you sometimes have auditors who will pick up on something because they've seen it, they've read it, but it's not entirely accurate in the way they're trying to employ it. For example, if a police officer detains an auditor, meaning the auditor's not free to go, the officer's conducting what we call an investigative detention of whatever the activity is, the officer is supposed to have, according to the Supreme Court, reasonable, articulable facts in his or her mind that would lead a reasonable officer to believe that crime is afoot. A crime is being, has been, or is about to be committed. That's pretty basic. Because of the words that are used by the Supreme Court, articulable facts, some auditors have been taught, well, that means that before the police can ask you any questions in an investigative detention, they must articulate, basically using it as a verb instead of an adjective. And I've seen encounters, well, officer, before I answer any of your questions, before I say anything, I need for you to articulate for me your articulable facts. And the officer says, well, I don't have to do that. Well, officer, are you familiar with the case of, and it kind of gets a little circular, it doesn't go anywhere. And it's frustrating for me because sometimes these auditors, I think, are right on point in that particular scenario. They may have the upper hand legally, but the way they're articulating it to the officers doesn't get them anywhere. And I don't know how that ever changes. You know, on the one hand, I try to educate law enforcement. I wish the auditors themselves had a means of being a little more fluent in some of this governing law. It might help both sides.
You know, I just want to comment. That's a really good observation that I had not considered about that articulate right. And I think that's well noted and things like that. And on that last thing that you pointed out, there's the Berkeley, this started in Berkeley, but CopWatch kind of developed and taught people how to do these things. I don't know if auditors have the same kind of resources. The few I've spoken to, I wonder, and maybe this is a question Evan can ask, they don't seem like a group of people that would go to training or something like that, even though that might be out there. And I don't even know if there's a First Amendment studies or First Amendment audit program or something like that people could do. I think that would be a great way to make extra money rather than ads for the local Toyota.
I know, that seems like a great business venture.
So we should give Scott some sort of training or a kickback on the funds there, whatever could be made.
I would say I have not seen any First Amendment auditor training, but that sounds like a very interesting concept. I mean, for myself, just like you guys, my only training has been just watching other people do it, watching the good, the bad, and the ugly, and watching, what I've gone out and tried to, at least stuff that I can put out and will put out in the future. I try to, at least when I go put out some work or film some work and then come back and edit it, I try to look at it through my perspective of how I want to do something. I look at it like, you got to almost make a show, right? You're making a small, either 1 minute or 8 minute TV show, and you got to capture an audience. So that's part of it as well. I mean, you're going out there to educate people. You're also going out there, like some of these people, you're going out there to make money. That's what they're using it as a job. It's realistic about that. It's great that we're all trying to go out there and accomplish, trying to spread the word and spread the message. But, it's a good question. Maybe there should be a First Amendment school, but as far as police going through, you said Fourth Amendment chain, learning Terry versus Ohio, Philadelphia versus Tennessee versus Gardner. That's all put in your head, right? As police officer training, but nobody goes through. I don't think, as far as police officers go through any type of First Amendment auditor training, as far as not even auditor, but just case law, like we said. But I mean, I can only think of like Smith versus Cumming, Georgia, and things like that come up in some minor appellate court laws, but there hasn't been anything major that says you can or cannot do things except for traditional public forums, right? So you do give a good point, and I wish more auditors were educated on the law and use it to their benefit. Instead of, like you said, I'm going to go out here and I'm going to you got to have your RAS, your reasonable territory of suspension, but really they should just be quiet. They should just invoke their right and just be quiet and listen, and then try to present their facts as to what they're doing. I think that their point would be come across, especially if they're talking to the general public, like, I'm just not going to say anything, and then I'm going to say, hey, this is why I'm here. I'm trying to educate either the officer, the people involved, and this is why I'm here. And if they did auditors did a better job explaining why they're doing what they're doing, I think they would get a better core reaction than just that I'm going to poke the bear in that realm.
I want to say when I was coding videos, when I was watching this, I coded like 40 hours of videos, and I stumbled across one channel that was called, I forget the exact name, but it was basically silent auditing. The person never said a word the entire time. And I think it was based out of Montana or somewhere up there. But it was funny and frustrating at the same time. I thought my speakers were broke when I was sitting there watching this, but it was an enjoyable experience nonetheless. But nobody ever confronted the person that I recall. But
yeah, I just edited a video a couple of days ago where it's not my video, I edited somebody else's and cut it down to a short, because that's kind of the way YouTube's going now. And the guys never said a word to the officer that came up to them. She just sat there and tried to talk to him. They just talked about eating burritos the entire time. And then eventually she just like turned and was like, oh, I guess we're done, and walked away. And I was like, this is gold.
Yeah, so I want to ask the same question, but what do people who get caught in First Amendment audits need to know, whether that's law enforcement, whether that's public employees, whether it's bystanders that are in a public building, people on public property or in a public forum? What do people who find themselves caught, subject of, however we want to frame it, of a First Amendment audit, what do they need to know? What are some tips? What are some things, again, legally, behavior-wise, whatever? What do they need to know?
I would say watch what you say, because you've got at least one camera on you. And some of these auditors are very clever, and they may be holding one camera and they've got a body worn camera mounted somewhere else. There's one of my favorite audits from about 5 years ago out of South Georgia, involves a very successful office auditor out of the state of Florida. Stood on the public sidewalk across from the Glenn County Sheriff's Office in the Glenn County Jail and watched and filmed deputies taking inmates from the Sheriff's Office from the jail to the county courthouse, which was next door, which in a lot of small southern counties, the courthouse and the sheriff are right next to each other. He got approached by two senior sheriff's officials. Are you recording inmates? Yes, I am. Well, you're being detained, and all this went on, and one of the sheriff's officials reached out and says, turn your camera off. He goes, no, so this is my right. And he reached out and grabbed it, removed it, but this guy's secondary camera recorded the whole thing. And he tried to do it again. And I think maybe when he realized that there was the secondary recording, he gave up on that. But watch what you say, and try to, especially if you're a public official, it may be annoying that someone's got a camera being aimed at you, but you have to remember you are a representative you are the government, and what you do say does have consequences, and you've got to be professional. And obviously now's not the time for you to be going a whole litany of what ifs. Of course, there are a lot of what ifs. What if it's a crime scene and we're talking about the police? What if it is the back upstairs corridor of a small public city hall in rural Iowa where there's no security, and you've got an 82-year-old records clerk trying to eat her lunch in a little backroom kitchen, and you've got an obnoxious auditor that comes to the door and starts focusing on eating her tuna sandwiches. Sir, what are you doing? Isn't this a public building? Well, yes, sir. Well, I own this building. I'm a taxpayer. And very rude, almost assaultive type conduct. And that's not appropriate either. So we need to understand that there are contexts, time, place, and manner, as the other speakers on here have alluded to, do matter. But at the same time, there is a wide amount of berth that auditors can have if they are in a public place, a traditional public forum, and we need to be mindful of what we say to them and how we, when we are the government, say that.
You know, I would echo that. It's all great advice. You know, sometimes it's difficult having that camera in your face, but I always enjoy and get a tickle out of when the auditors point out, you know, there's cameras in every public building. And, you know, the discrepancy between one entity can do it and the other one can't is a bit much. But, you know, the only advice I would give to the people who are on the receiving ends of these audits is, you know, remember the advice you would give young people and their kids. What you do and post on the internet will be there forever. And that's same true if somebody else posts you of something on, you know, the internet. It's going to be there for a long time and can be quite embarrassing and things like that. So one of the auditors that I've seen quite a few, if I was ever approached in a situation like that, generally I found if you leave them alone, they don't bother you. That's not what they're there for. Or you offer some support. But the one auditor I've seen quite a few of his videos, he just goes, just say hi, mom. You remember, like, you know, when, you know, we were kids and there was a camera, it was a very rare thing. And you just, hi, mom, and you see it on the news later. That's really what it comes down to, is something like that. But it can be stressful. And so it's tricky. You know, there's a difference between the law of what you can say and manners and decorum and things like that. But, you know, whether they're doing it for views or money or anything like that, I think at the core, people are expressing their free speech rights. And again, it's always the not so nice people who are expressing these ideas that need First Amendment protection. And I think a lot of people marginalize and think lowly of these groups, right? I hear the word frauditor and things like that. But whether it's legitimate or not, it's a right. And those rights are there for a reason. So just be mindful of that.
Evan? You can always say pass.
No, that's good. I was just listening to both of you guys. What you both said were fantastic, and you know, I know exactly what you're talking about, David. And you know, Jason is a great person, and as far as I'm concerned, and I think he does a great job out there. And you know, if you do look at it back, you know, and you know, the 70s and 80s, and when, you know, people were on camera, especially news, you know, people did, you know, when they came to the cameras, hi mom, you know, things like that. That was great. And now when you're sad, now people are like, oh, why are you doing this? You know, I do agree that if you just treat them, you know, like normal people, they're probably just going to leave you alone. They're probably not going to get that right. Or they don't want I'm sorry, I'm not putting this right. They're looking for the negative reaction, right? But not all the time do people. I'm not putting this right. I'm trying to think about my own regard when I've gone out there. You know, I'm not trying to always look for a negative reaction from people, and I don't think that's what the goal of that is. But I'm not coming across right on this. I'm sorry. My daughter's doing something out here. But I do agree that if you're going to say something, make sure you're saying something properly. Make sure you're articulating it the way you want to, and you're not coming off, you know, as argumentative. I think you're not going to get your point across that way.
So, public property versus public forum. What's the difference? I'm confused. Why can't I take my camera and walk onto Area 51 and record as a tax-paying citizen? Why can't I do that?
Oh, this sounds like a Scott question all day.
I just look, a public forum is, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, is that area that has traditionally been associated with the greatest amount of First Amendment protection. They will talk about your parks, your open gathering places, your public sidewalks. Doesn't mean, of course, you can block a sidewalk and impede pedestrian access, but somewhere where you can be out there, whether it's handing out religious literature, political literature or proclaiming the supremacy of good versus evil or evil versus good, there is a well-recognized First Amendment right to do that. Now, as you leave that traditional public forum, the Supreme Court has recognized other designations such as a limited public forum, and then you have what are considered non-public forums. I would say the biggest, I don't want to say it's the biggest debate because I really don't know how much this is even being discussed, but what I can see where the case law, as this continues to play out, and sometimes I tell officers, where's the case law on this? I said, the case law is trying to catch up to the reality of the day. We don't have that yet, but it is on the notion, and to use a legal word, to conflate, to basically collapse the notion of, does publicly accessible mean public place? Because if you have cases that have said there is a First Amendment right, you've got 6 out of the 12, and actually 7 out of the 12 United States Circuit Court of Appeals have recognized that there is an absolute protected First Amendment right to film government officials out in public. What about the interior of local government buildings? It's publicly accessible. Is that the same thing as out in public? What I am seeing, with one exception, out of one federal court in Georgia, I am seeing court after court say, the interior of a local government building is not a public forum. And therefore, if it's not a public forum where traditional First Amendment interests have been upheld at the Supreme Court said at their zenith, at their highest level, it is easier for the government to regulate it. What the government can't do, however, is to say, we'll allow anyone to come in and you can come in and record all you want. We just don't want those auditors. We don't like their purpose. We don't like their message. If the government is going to prohibit photography, and I believe it can be defended based on the case law out there, if a city hall or a county administrative building wants to ban photography or video inside, I believe there's plenty of law to support that. But what they can't do is be selective and base it on content. I like your content, I don't like yours. They do that, they have no right to do that. But that, hopefully, Max, kind of answers, there is a difference between rights that are enforceable out in public and just because a place is publicly accessible. And I think we're going to see a lot more development in that case law because that's where a lot of these confrontations that I'm seeing on YouTube that we're all watching are happening right now.
Yeah, and just oh, go ahead, Evan.
Go ahead. Okay. To echo that, I mean, look at a courthouse. A traditional public place would be the outside of a courthouse, right? You can go out there and exercise your free speech and exercise whatever you want to say. However, the inside of a courtroom is not necessarily, it is a public place the public can go to. That is not a traditional public forum where you can go and just freely express your rights and expressions. And to define that even further, especially in modern cases or modern courtrooms, just to use that example, there is clear signage that says no one can go film in here. So, like Scott was saying, it clearly defines who cannot and can come in here. It's excluding everyone, right? And I to say what echo what Scott was saying, it's not saying that auditors can't come in here. It's just saying everybody can't film here. And I think that's really how it needs to be put out there. Is there needs to be a clear line, and I think at least with courthouses you've done that. And I think if the government wants to do that with any other building or any other quote unquote public place, they need to set that precedent. Like, hi, you can go and film a police department, you can come into our lobby, but there needs to be a definition of everybody's excluded past this point. And I think as long as everyone understands that, I think everyone would be okay with that.
Yeah, when I try to explain this distinction between public forums and public places, I always make a joke to the students about how I would go up to the Supermax prison out in Colorado and ask for the tour since it's a publicly available place. Why can't I go in and, see if there's a gift shop or something like that, just to kind of explain those distinctions. But I did see one audit once where it was in the common room or the room you would sit to go meet with somebody who was in jail. And I guess the waiting room. And an auditor walked into there, and I was like, if there's a situation ripe for this not being a place open for, traditionally speech related activities, I would think it would be that, but nobody had any issues with them being there, and observing this kind of, people talking on the phones to people, their loved ones or friends in jail. And so I thought that was quite questionable. But in terms of the question of place, right, I think that's there. But also, there's case law to support the idea of distance away from the officers when they're out in public. I've seen auditors get right up close to the this situation, the police investigating them and things like that. So I would think, and maybe Scott can correct me if I'm wrong, but there could, a city could pass some ordinance to say, you're, happy to film police, but you have to stay at least 15 feet away or something like that. And that becomes a quagmire for situations where, well, I was 14 foot away or something like that. But there's certainly kind of perspectives like that, and too, when we're talking about these times, places, and manners.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think it was Arizona about a year ago who actually enacted a state statute. And I don't remember what the distance was, but to try and do that. And I know it was immediately challenged. But here's where this disinformation comes into play. One of my favorite videos, and I noticed recently it was taken down. I had an article published in Police Magazine in 2019 on this topic. And in the online version, I included, the hyperlink so they could link to the actual videos, because I referred to like 7 or 8 videos. And when I looked about 2 months ago, almost all were up, but this one was taken down. But it was out of San Diego, California. And a motorcycle officer was citing a woman, and her kids were in the car, citing her for speed. 2 auditors walked up and were up close in the officer's business. And the officer said, "Can't you just stand back a little bit, please? I'm nervous with you there," which is understandable. The auditor very assertedly, and it brings me back to law school, where a law professor once said, if you boldly assert something and plausibly argue it, you can accomplish anything. And this auditor looked right at the officer and says, "Excuse me, sir, but hasn't the Supreme Court said that 10 feet is the appropriate distance?" And the officer, not wanting to look like, "Gee, I should have known that," he was like, "Well, yeah, but I just wish you could stand over here." The officer bought into it. Well, truth be told, the Supreme Court's never said any such thing. The Supreme Court's never even addressed the subject of First Amendment auditors. But in one case out of the U.S. First Circuit involving an audit out on the Boston Commons, the distance, I think, was around or exceeded 10 feet. And the court in passing said, yeah, they weren't right up on top of the officer. There was this distance. And so you have members of the auditor community that take that, attribute it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and are spouting it back. And you may have officers that like, "Why wasn't I told that?" Okay.
So
that's
question.
Good to know for future instances I might find myself in. I'll just make things up.
I think there's probably a lot of truth in if you just boldly assert something to someone who doesn't know. Probably
the law, the professor's exact words were, "The law is nothing more than that which is boldly asserted and plausibly argued."
Which is how I got this job, boldly asserted and plausibly argued. So
possible deniability.
Yeah, exactly. So last question. What's the future of these First Amendment audits? Is this just a flash in the pan? Is this a YouTube fad that's going to go away soon? Or what's the future of this, in your opinion? If you have any thoughts on that at all?
I don't know. Let me say one thing, which I only became really aware of in the last 12 months. And again, I've been studying this. Dave talks about his, spouse saying, what are you, watching all these videos? I mean, my wife, so many times over the years, has walked through the room and says, yeah, show me your ID. Why do you have to see my, because I'm watching these kinds of videos. But I think one thing that Dave touched on, which I was not really aware of until about a year ago, he talked about the idea of a frauditor. So for so long, we had just the First Amendment auditors with all their videos. There are now others out there who like to poke fun out, who like to try and dismantle some of what the auditors are doing and dissect and critique and add funny memes. And so a lot of these folks are calling the auditors frauditors, meaning, yeah, they're not really up to anything noble. They're just out to make a flash in the pan, get some money from their followers, and I mean, there may be some like that, but there are others who legitimately think they're trying to advance the cause of the First Amendment. But the frauditor channels provide a lot of entertainment too. I have found myself on occasion looking at those. And again, just like with the auditor movement, there are some well-intentioned statements that are actually misinterpreting or misstating the law. And I just hate that, because others will see that, take it for, gospel truth, and might themselves get into a position they might regret because they're relying on advice they got on YouTube.
Yeah, I would say, what's the future for these like, and the future is always uncertain, but I do know from what I know about Weird Al is when people start making fun of you, you're established, right? You're going to be there for a while. But I also know that this is more of whether this particular kind of First Amendment advocacy, filming people, continues in its current form. I try to put this in context of all other types of First Amendment activities and, the filming the police. That's why, I'm thinking about Cop Watch in Berkeley and LA during the Civil Rights era, those kind of things. Observing the police, I don't think is going to go away anytime soon. I think it's part of who we are as a society and as a nation. Those kind of things, especially in recent years, that's only been exacerbated, right? Because it's not just First Amendment auditors observing the police and things like that. Those, Darnella Frazier, who was recording George Floyd and all those kind of situations, they serve a purpose too. And basically they're doing the same thing, filming the police. But, I often equate First Amendment auditors with the people on the street corners who would be out there yelling their ideas and whatever they might be about, society being damned and, the end of the world's coming soon. They might be in your face, abrasive and ostentatious and all these kind of other things. But at the end of the day, they're exercising free speech and those kind of ideas. And so I can only see this kind of activity continue. But I also know in that evolution of those people who speak those, worlds coming to an end and stuff like that, people used to get baited into those and would engage and argue back and get very upset. And they used to do it on college campuses, still do it on college campuses to provoke a fight and provoke a lawsuit. And so in this sense, you could argue that First Amendment auditors are doing basically the kind of same approach. And those campus speakers and they've been around for a long, long time. And I don't think this is going to go away in any particular form. It might evolve or do something like that. But I think this kind of thing will be around for a while. But we'll see how successful it is the real question. But I don't think it'll go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon either. I do think it will evolve and probably has evolved even from the beginning. I think you'll probably start seeing people that are more successful at it and doing it in a more positive way get more attention, and probably in the same respect, people who are doing it in a very negative way get more attention. And I think you're going to weed out a lot of the people who just are just doing it either just for the temporary fame or just for the temporary buzz or like or whatever. And then, like Scott was saying, when I would go out there and do it, my wife would be like, what are you doing? It doesn't make any sense. And she goes, oh, you're being terrible at this. Why did you say this? Why did you do that? And I took a lot of what she had to say to heart, because I was like, well, she's somebody who doesn't, she wasn't there. She doesn't understand as far as what I'm doing. And then as she started listening to my progression of how I would start, when she would give me those tips, like if I were to listen to you I were to go watch you, or I were to, do this, I would like you to say these kind of things. And I took a lot of that to heart and going, that is a much better approach. People are going to respect that a lot more. And so I think, I would hope that it would continue in that, in that fashion. I think, as far as the frauditor comment goes, I've always found that would be kind of interesting. I've got a more of a troll kind of movement as far as just people trying to egg, them on. But, and thinking about, the Weird Al concept, if you're being made fun of, somebody's watching you. So, and another point of that being, just like you were saying about listening to people on the street corner, somebody's got to deliver the message, and if that's a radical message, whether you think it's radical or whether you think it's, something you don't want to hear, if somebody isn't out there saying it, and this quote, one other famous auditor, rights are like muscles. If you are out there flexing them and using them, then they're going to go away. So, I would like to say, from my perspective, we aren't out there, protecting our rights, then what rights do we want to keep? And why are we even trying? Well, why as a society, what are they for, right? And I think, as long as they're being used properly, then, we're doing good. And I think that's the point.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. To anybody who may be watching us, if you enjoyed today's conversation and would like to see more like this, please consider donating to the First Amendment Museum today. Find us on our website, firstamendmentmuseum.org. See a big red button that says donate. Scott, Evan, David, thank you guys so much. This talk was fantastic. Do you guys have any last words or anything, or are we good to go?
I kind of was curious what everybody's favorite First Amendment audit was.
I have no idea, but I'll let you guys answer. I don't know if I watched it where I have a favorite.
You all have one
there's
or a
definitely
channel
one
that
that
stands out?
stands out in my mind that I use in my presentation. It was in South Carolina, like a local, some sort of local building, and the people freaked out. And I use it as an example of what not to do, how not to react. When a First Amendment auditor comes in, it was like, it's from years ago. I wish I knew exactly what it was from. But that's the one that stands out in mind because I use it in my presentations, but I can't remember who did it or when. What about you guys? Go ahead.
What's your favorite one, David?
It's there's a number of channels. There's a lot of channels, or news now from wherever. And
Right.
I talked to one auditor and said, one of the first ones that they ever watched was from News Now Houston, and then everybody just kind of followed that along. And so when I was interviewing him, I was like, do you all know each other and stuff like that? And he goes, kind of, sort of, not really. And, that was a challenge for me trying to research people. I don't think they're, some auditors are open talking to others that are not, well connected for whatever reason. But I watch James Freeman. Sometimes he's not a First Amendment auditor per se. He does a lot of other things, but I always get a tickle out of the genre where the auditors ask the police the questions the police would ask. Have you been drinking? Have you been, can you put that weapon away? Can I hold that weapon? I always love those kind of inversion of power structures. But my favorite approach is when there's about like 4 or 5 auditors all get together and go auditing as a group, because it's everything that we've talked about. It's confrontational stuff, but it's also like, boys out weekend or something like that, where they're just out having a hoot and all this kind of stuff. And I particularly enjoy watching those just for the pure entertainment value. But I didn't know if there was one that really kind of stands out or went viral in everybody's mind.
For me, I guess I got 2 perspectives now that you bring something like that. But Jeff Gray out in Georgia, South Carolina, Florida area just does a fantastic job as far as flipping the script and also presenting the case. Standing out there with the homeless veteran sign, and people just getting very, very upset about it. And he's just saying, "God bless the homeless vets," and people take it as he's panhandling. And it's just so weird to see somebody get so upset about just that particular piece of free speech, and he's not even doing it in a negative way. And I just thought that was very interesting. And then on the topic of James Freeman and Direct D and all those guys who just went out to New Mexico, and a whole group of like 13 people just went out and did it. I was like, oh, this is fantastic, and the cops just had no idea what to do. Like, what do we do with all of these guys here? It was hysterical to me. But
Scott, you don't have a favorite one? You don't have a favorite audit video?
I've seen so many, and some are great. I do like the one that I referred to that was done in Glenn County, Georgia, a few years ago, where the auditor had a body camera on in addition, and he was affiliated with an organization which I've only seen through the audit movement, but called Photography is Not a Crime, PNAC, PINAC. They used to have shirts that would say PNAC, be the media, in encouraging people to monitor the police and to film the police. And when one of the sheriff's officials said, well, why are you doing? You do on this your own, or who are you with? He goes, photography is not a crime. Well, no, I know what your philosophy is. Well, who are you working for? He goes, photography is not a crime. No, you don't understand. It was like a Saturday Night Live episode.
Like Abbott Costello.
They were talking past each other. And then ultimately he said, photography is not a crime.com, a news organization out of Orlando. And the guy's like, oh.
Well, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.